You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. In an attempt to sound particularly intellectual today, I thought I'd start today's episode on the laws of war with a quote. Now, this is easier said than done, as I found out before. Mankind seems to have an affinity with war, and there are literally thousands of quotes to choose from. Nevertheless, as our guest is joining us today from Oxford, I decided to go with a quote from the English writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley. The most shocking fact about war is that its victims and its instruments are individual human beings, and that these individuals are condemned by the monstrous conventions of politics to murder or be murdered in quarrels not of their own. Why did I go with this quote? Well, it struck me as particularly poignant because today's episode discusses the political manoeuvring and behind-the-scenes forces that were in play when European states first sought to codify the laws of war in the 19th century. Driven by a desire to create an equilibrium between the great powers of the day, the primary goal of these codification efforts was to limit the scope of conflicts and to hasten a return to peace. Now, although warfare has evolved over the last century, I think it's fair to say that the associated death and destruction unfortunately has not. Moreover, with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the stakes have even further increased. So, what could today's politicians learn from the politicians of yesteryear when it comes to reining in conflicts before they spiral out of control? To provide us with an answer to this question, I'm pleased to be joined today by Raphael Schäfer. Raphael is a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, and, as I mentioned previously, is joining us today from Oxford, where he's working on his master's. Raphael, sounds like you're a very busy fella, so thanks very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Brilliant. Yes. Well, then let's begin. And what struck me when preparing for today's podcast on the laws of war was I primarily came across references to the Geneva Conventions. However, your area of research predates these conventions by over 100 years. So perhaps we can kick things off and you can tell us exactly what the laws of war are in the context of your research and how they differ from the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting that you mentioned this. So when we speak about the legal regulation of warfare, the Geneva Conventions are regularly among the first things that come to mind, and rightly so, as I would say, because they are not only among the best known international treaties of all, especially beyond the borders of our discipline, but are, with currently 196 ratifications, universally accepted. However, I would say it is not enough to speak about the Geneva Conventions as such, because if you take a closer look, they represent a kind of set, if you wish, of 4 treaties that were adopted in 1949, obviously as a kind of reaction to the Second World War and the horrors that took place there, and 3 additional protocols, the first 2 adopted in 1977 and the 3rd additional protocol of 2005. So maybe we have a closer look at these 4 treaties to begin with. And I would suggest that if we already look at the titles of these 4 treaties, this might be quite helpful. So the first Geneva Convention is titled the Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armed Forces in the Field. So already it speaks a language that we probably wouldn't use in that way anymore today. And then again, it was first adopted already in 1864, revised in 1906, 1929, and then finally the current version of 1941. The second convention then speaks about the amelioration of the condition of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, which is in a way a successor of the Hague Convention number 10 of 1907. The third convention is relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and the fourth convention relative to protection of civilian persons in time of war, which is based in parts of the Hague Convention that was adopted in 1899 and then later modified in 1907.
Okay, right. So you've listed 4 long names there for treaties: amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in the armed forces, and shipwrecked members at sea, and the treatment of prisoners of war, and the protection of civilian persons in times of war. What then can we take from all these treaties as a whole?
I would say especially two things. First, that the 1949 conventions, and even these ones that were adopted for the first time, were nothing completely new, but rather a development of pre-existing rules after the horrible experiences of the Second World War. And a closer look at these rules then takes us back quite some time to either earlier Geneva Conventions or to other treaties known by the term Hague Convention. So we have two kind of bodies of law that are known as the Geneva law on the one hand and the Hague law on the other hand. And normally the Geneva law treats or addresses the persons hors de combat, which means either sick, wounded, or not anymore participating in warfare. And the Hague law addresses the conduct of the military operations, so the soldiers.
Okay, so Geneva is about non-combatants, if you will, or wounded and sick, and the Hague Conventions are about how states themselves should conduct warfare.
Exactly, when they first came about, and this later merged in modern international humanitarian law with the introduction of the additional protocol. However, what I also found interesting, and I think is worth to state, that all of these four conventions have an identical article, the so-called Common Article 3, which is also sometimes referred to as Convention en miniature, Convention en miniature in the literature. And this is so because this article contains the bare minimum that must always be observed in war. So as the provision is rather long, it would be too tiring for the audience, I assume, to read it out in full.
Okay.
But I would still like to highlight the most important aspects. So this provision says that in the case of armed conflict, not of an international character occurring in the territory of one of the high contracting parties, each party to the conflict shall be bound to apply as a minimum the following provisions. And then we have a long list. Mm-hmm. So persons taking no active part in the hostilities shall in all circumstances be treated humanely. So this is the element of humanity, yes, which also gave the whole body of law the name international humanitarian law, if you want. And then we have a catalog of specific acts that are forbidden. So, for example, violence to life and person, murder, mutilation, cruel treatment, and so forth, the taking of hostages, outrages upon personal dignity, and the like. And then the second paragraph states that the wounded and sick shall be collected and cared for.
Okay, by which parties then?
By the parties to the conflict.
Okay. And they have a responsibility for both their and their conflicting parties. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So one could easily make the argument that the main difference is a temporal one between the Geneva Conventions, or the international humanitarian law as it is called today, and the laws of war, in the form of a predecessor-successor relationship. However, I thought that this was too short-sighted in a way, perhaps even too obvious to be correct in such absolute terms. Especially in international humanitarian law, as the legal body regulating states' behavior during armed conflict, we are facing a lot of master narratives. So while they differ in detail, they always evolve along a shock reaction to the horrors of war. And basically, you have that after each war. Mm-hmm. Because if in a way each war is a horror in itself.
Okay.
Combined with the need to humanize war, which already sounds a bit difficult to achieve in the first place.
The humanization of war is.
Exactly. So taken to its extreme, this leads to downright ludicrous arguments, I would say. So it was the official Prussian and later then Imperial German position, for example, that the most humane war is the war that is waged particularly brutally. And why is that so? Because it has a demoralizing effect on the opponent, who then capitulates more quickly. And so then, if you would have a look at the total numbers, a shorter war has less casualties than a longer war would have. This way, by definition, to the Prussian doctrine, it would be more humane.
A more humane war.
Just calculate the bare numbers.
Oh, right. I mean, that's somewhat, obviously it's Prussia, but with Germany in World War II, the concept of blitzkrieg as well. Was that similar in some ways there?
I did not work on World War II, but
Okay.
I would have difficult to say that the Nazi government was concerned with making war humane. Rather, I think it was the tactic to have it kind of an assault and as quickly as possible so other powers could not intervene anymore.
Okay.
And to create a fait accompli.
Fair enough, yeah.
So from our perspective today, I would say that this is, of course, an absurd argument.
The Prussian argument that war should be
Exactly.
waged quickly and brutally to make it quick.
Exactly.
Okay.
But I was wondering what was necessary to make the argument work, because there had to be something else behind this reasoning, and this is what I wanted to find out.
Okay, sure. I guess we will get back to not only the Prussians, but a few other large European powers later in our podcast today. The timescale, though, of your research coincides with a great deal of upheaval in continental Europe. The French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, large-scale warfare probably not seen before. How did these kind of changing forms of gunpowder as well, for instance, of military conflict during the period challenge the traditional way in which warfare was governed and conducted?
First question would be, of course, what the traditional way of warfare is.
That's
because,
very true.
as you already mentioned, with gunpowder and the like, with each technological advancement, war is waged in a different way. So I'm not an expert in military history and can address the question only from my perspective as an international lawyer. And my perspective is, of course, historically informed, but it's mainly a legal perspective. So what I can say is that the French Revolution and with it the Napoleonic Wars marked a turning point in European history. Now, this is, of course, a truism, and we can read that in any history book and learned it in school. But if you consult the primary sources, you really get an impression of how profound this change was. It was really for the contemporaries like hour zero, Stunde Null, in a way, where the world was a different place after.
Okay.
So I chose a quote now by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who I did not know was joining the campaign of a German Duke, Herzog Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Braunschweig in 1792, who intervened in France to save the monarchy, basically.
And he joined as a traveling poet and author, or as a scholar, or he was actually fighting?
He was not fighting.
Oh, okay.
He was a how do you say, Kriegsberichterstatter, a military reporter.
Yeah, military
field
reporter. Okay, right. Oh, very interesting. Jeez, I'm always learning new stuff on the Lawcast. Okay, sorry. Continue with your quote there from Goethe.
And so in that campaign in 1792, the Revolutionary Army succeeded in bringing the Prussian army to a halt. And that was a major victory for the French, of course. And Goethe said, quote, "A new epoch in world history begins here and now, and you can say you were part of it." End of quote.
Okay.
And this event was the so-called Kanonade of Valmy, which was mystically glorified and turned into something that it never was. So, for example, the French would say that it was a complete brigade of civilians that managed to make the Prussian halt, omitting that there were a lot of professional soldiers being part of that army, for example. And so this managed to make the old system, in a way, right, the monarchical system, halt by the forces of the revolutionary idea. So I don't want to focus too much here on Valmy and the French Revolution, but this event was largely responsible for the politicization and psychologization of warfare, and thus in the end also for its totalization. So, for example, we can take another quote by Ferdinand Foch, the great French general during the First World War, who commented on Valmy with the words, "The wars of kings had come to an end, and the wars of nations had begun." And I think it's the best possible description, actually, because military conflict in the 18th century in Europe was characteristic by cabinet wars. That means wars between two or more monarchs. And these wars followed their own rules and logics, which were determined by especially one principle, limitation. Be that limitation in goals, resources, in outcome, and to make it as short or simple as possible, the political map of Europe would, after a cabinet war, be more or less always the same. So, if I can give you a short anecdote on that part, Friedrich Wilhelm I, father of Friedrich der Große, had the byname Soldatenkönig, Soldier King, because of his obsession with all things military. But ironically, he participated only in one war. And that's because he loved his army so much, which was for him more of a representative toy than an actual political instrument. The soldiers of his infantry regiment, known as Potsdam Giants, or in German Lange Kerls, because of their unusual size, all way over 180, were handpicked from all over Europe, and he paid considerable sums of money to get them, comparable to today's headhunting of professional football players in a way. So the army was by all means only the business of the monarch, and this changed with the French Revolution, and especially with the introduction of the levée en masse. It led to the fact that people, like the people of France in that case, identified with the army and created the citizen soldier.
And that's like conscription then?
Exactly, but also unwillingly conscripted. So everyone who was able to fight had to fight.
Okay.
It was like a political duty.
I see.
The political scientist Herfried Münkler made an interesting point in comparing the Prussian military music and the war songs of the French Revolution, saying the Prussian marching music was intended to set the rhythm for a more or less mechanical sequence of steps, right? So that the armies would march synchronically.
Yes.
And the Marseillaise, however, inflamed the will to victory of those who defended France against the intervention of the European princes. So the Revolutionary Wars ended the limitation of the cabinet wars, which until then had been in a way a customary agreement. And this shift was also perceived by contemporaries. So we have Karl von Clausewitz, for example, the famous Prussian military theorist, who observed the French had let loose the terrible element of war from its old financial and diplomatic bonds. It now strode along with its brute force, rolling away with it an immense mass of forces, and one saw nothing but ruins of the old art of war on the one side and unheard of success on the other.
Okay, right. So we've moved from the very small wars of, as you said, kind of from monarchs and their armies, which had limited resources, limited financial means, to this concept of forced conscription, nation states combating against each other on a much, much larger scale. The fact then became that warfare and wars as a whole were larger and increasingly more deadly. Did the loss of life and property that could ensue from these new wars or cannonades using massed artillery and the like, was this a catalyst for this new approach to regulating war, or was it something else that was at play?
Well, I wish I could say it was, but the historical and legal sources I consulted do not support this assumption. Rather, it seemed to be the destructive effect that war could have on the European state order as such. Remember, I said during the cabinet wars, the borders were moved by several kilometers, several hundred kilometers sometimes, but Prussia would still be the same Prussian state before, and Austria would be still the same Austrian state as it was before. But this changed with the French Revolution, and it had to be ensured that wars could be waged in a limited way, even in the emerging age of nation states, and the fight not only for a king, like the classical conscription would be, but also the fight for your own nation or for an idea, like during the French Revolution, without dragging the whole of Europe into this conflict.
Okay, so there was the kind of the danger, I guess, there with previously limited resources could become almost unlimited then and used to fight, create a conflagration of conflict across Europe.
No.
Okay.
And there existed some humanitarian concerns, but the focus was more on reducing suffering of the people hors de combat, like the wounded and the like. But even this concern was politicized in a way. Okay,
so it wasn't purely out of a desire to curb human suffering that these new regulations on the laws of war came about.
It certainly played a role, but it was not the sole reason for that.
So we got the nation states there formed. There's less fiefdoms and kingdoms, and they see a need then to contain geopolitical conflicts, hasten a return to peace. They understand that with changing means of war, things can take very quickly a turn for the worse, and significantly for the worse. What did they then decide to do about this? So what happened next?
So my research covered the time from the 18th century to the First World War, and this is why I can only paint a very rough picture here in terms of the time we have. But so after the defeat of Napoleon, the victorious powers that called themselves the Concert of Europe held a congress in Vienna. And in the literature, the outcome of the Congress of Vienna was often portrayed as a restoration of the old system. At least it's something what I still learned in school. But as far as international law is concerned, this is quite not the case. It was rather the opposite. For the first time, I would say, the order that was given to Europe was decidedly based on international law. If you want, the final act of 9th of June 1814 can be considered a kind of basic law for Europe. I wouldn't say of Europe, but law for Europe. And this so-called Viennese system, which has established a normativized balance of power that also introduced the principle of pacta sunt servanda, like treaties have to be fulfilled, worked fairly well for a time. Of course, there were several diplomatic conflicts and crises, but the system was able to adapt. This then came to an end when 3 of the 5 so-called great powers, which were mainly the victorious powers in the alliances against Napoleon. So,
if I just stop you there, could you maybe just run us through who the 5 great powers were of the day?
Of course. So, first of all, the great powers consisted of the successful victorious powers against France that were Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia, unified in the alliance of the 4 powers.
Okay.
But it was also remarkable that already in 1818, so 4 years or 3 years, depending on how you count, after the Congress of Vienna and the Peace of Paris, France was admitted to the concert of European powers. And then it became also a great power again.
So there wasn't a feel we have to crush France, not engage with the French nation again, rather 3 or 4 years later, we're willing to let them back into the fold.
Because the powers said they were not fighting the French people or the French state, they were fighting Napoleon. So it was really a war against an individual, and the French people were seen as the first victim of Napoleon, so to say. And they understood at that time that it was necessary for a stable balance of power to have France back in that system. Of course, France was very lucky to have a very talented diplomat, Talleyrand, who understood how he could make use of the political system of the time and present his country in the best way. So then 3 of the 5 great powers engaged in a war over the question of influence on the Ottoman Empire. So there was France and Britain on the one side and the Russian Empire on the other. And of course, a lot of things could be said now about the Crimean War, but this conflict, to make it short, put an end to the idea that war in Europe could be contained by the great powers, as it has been done for about 40 years. So instead, the focus was now on regulating the way war was waged, but interestingly, only in Europe and between European powers. So this would not apply overseas.
Okay, so it was very much also not about avoiding war, that was accepted war is a fact of life, but rather how we can contain war once it's begun.
Once it's begun, exactly, yeah. And now this took place in various stages, of which the Geneva Convention of 1864, the Petersburg Declaration of 1868, and the Brussels Declaration of 1874 are the most important. And the latter was then ratified with minor changes at the Hague Conference in 1899 and again updated in The Hague in 1907. And the latter ones in 1899, 1907 are the ones we know mainly today. Okay. And now, of course, each of these legal documents has its own history that needs to be put in context and critically analyzed in way more detail than is possible here. But at the end of the day, each of the European great powers tried to use these conferences to legitimize its own approach to warfare. So Britain, for example, did not want to see warfare at sea regulated. The German Empire and the Russian Empire, the powers with the biggest standing armies, for example, sought to rule out as much as possible the levée en masse, of course.
Okay.
So for the smaller powers like the Netherlands or Belgium, on the other hand, the levée en masse was, of course, the sharpest weapon of national defense, and they wanted to make use of it as much as possible. So what makes things quite difficult, but also interesting, is that it is impossible to understand for example, the Prussian position towards France without understanding the Russian position towards Austria. And you can continue to play that game with the British position towards Russia and the Austrian position towards France. So it's all a net of interdependencies.
Certainly they came with very different ideas then to the table each time about, for them, what they wanted to protect and what they wanted to regulate. I mean, it sounds very intricate, a game of cat and mouse, everyone kind of vying for their own agenda, the big five at the table, smoking cigars, no doubt. And smaller nations in the corner, they're also, I guess, looking out for themselves. Plenty of political intrigue. I think it definitely sounds like the thing for a possible Netflix series even. I mean, you have talked about, I guess, the main countries at the negotiating table. Let's go a little bit more deeply then into not only their individual, but also their common goals.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I actually did get some kind of anachronistically speaking House of Cards vibes when reading the archival sources and dispatches that are luckily available for us now.
Okay.
And there exists, for example, also several so-called seriocomic maps of Europe, especially by an artist called Fred Rose, that nicely reflect these entanglements. So if you would just put that in Google seriocomic map and Fred Rose, you will see what I mean. And this is quite interesting.
Okay.
It's a visualization of these interdependencies of the European powers.
Okay, I'll definitely check that out then. Serio Comics by Fred Rose.
Seriocomic map.
A Seriocomic map, okay, of Europe by Fred Rose. Thank you.
So the main countries involved in this gamble for Europe were, of course, the members of the Concert of Europe, or the so-called Great Powers we spoke about earlier. But then again, each country, of course, had their leading figures. So especially Otto von Bismarck in Prussia and later Imperial Germany, who I would say mastered the rules of the game like no other. And Napoleon III, for example, who tried to outdo Bismarck, but failed in the end.
Uh-huh. Napoleon III, was he some way related then to the original Napoleon?
Actually, he was. So he was the nephew of Napoleon I, but came to power through a coup d'etat. So he was not known as Napoleon III at the time, but known by his civil name.
Oh, I see. Okay. And he even tried to outdo the Iron Chancellor, Bismarck, there at the negotiating table.
Not necessarily at the negotiating table, but in this kind of diplomatic games of promising one thing to one state and the opposite thing to another state.
Ah, okay. The material for our Netflix series.
Exactly, and Bismarck understood that. He offered, or he made sure to make, for example, certain offers to France if Napoleon would stay still during the war between Prussia and Austria and not intervene. Because this would have been an easy option to take control over the south of Germany, for example.
Okay, right.
And would later pay France back with certain territories west of the Rhine, for example. And then later, when it was the case, Bismarck never heard of any of that, or was not aware of having said anything of that kind.
Oh, he'd forgotten about those promises.
Exactly. And then there were, of course, some kind of conspiracies being forged with Napoleon offering something to Bismarck, and the French ambassador was negligent enough to give him a written text, a letter, which Bismarck later, when the Franco-German War started, published in English media, English newspaper, to discredit the French.
Oh, okay.
Again, to make Prussia take the moral high ground, so to speak.
Okay. So you have a lot of figures here, I guess, working the stage both domestically and within Europe as a whole.
Exactly. So Austria and Prussia were mainly preoccupied with the struggle for supremacy in Germany at that time. France, as I said, under Napoleon III, aspired to become the dominating country in Europe again. And the Russian Empire, which was kind of moved out of Europe after the Crimean War in a way, was struggling to keep its influence on Europe. And for Britain, which never understood itself as a European power, it was only important that the situation on the continent was more or less stable so it could focus on its empire overseas, basically.
Yes, well, Raphael, thank you very much, sir, for that. Don't go away. I'll be back with Raphael to talk more about the laws of war after this short break.
Welcome to Max Planck Law, one of the world's largest networks for legal research, based in Germany. Our world-class institutes invite applications for fully funded PhD and postdoc opportunities in almost any area of law. Join a thriving community of over 400 researchers in an international and interdisciplinary environment. Experience the high quality of life that Germany offers while collaborating with colleagues across institutes, working and writing in English. We provide you with unique specialist libraries, excellent workspaces, and support in developing your research and your academic career. Apply today. For more information, visit law.mpg.de.
Well, great. Welcome back to the Lawcast. Our guest today is Raphael Schäfer. Before the break, Raphael kind of ran us through the peace congresses in particularly the 19th century. We looked at some of the great powers of the day and what they were up to and at the negotiating table or perhaps behind closed doors elsewhere, scheming and wheeling and dealing. I now want to skip, Raphael, if I may, to I guess the very end of the period you're studying, which is World War I. We talked before that the laws of war weren't necessarily about stopping conflict, but certainly were about curbing it before it gets too far out of control and goes for too long. What went so wrong in the advent or the lead up and the advent of World War I?
So we have to be careful here to be very precise, as also in the first part, of course, but here especially. So in today's international law, there's a strict differentiation between the law on the use of force, which we sometimes call the jus ad bellum, or in a more modern interpretation, jus contra bellum, because it should prohibit the use of force, and the law applicable during warfare, the so-called jus in bello, the law during warfare. So this strict differentiation did not exist in the 19th century. However, states were not completely free to wage war as they wished. All of the conflicts I analyzed were justified or localized before they were started in one way or the other. And this was surprisingly often or regularly done in the language of international law by referring to a prior breach of the other party, be that true or not. Mm-hmm. But the case was being made, and normally a corresponding treaty was quoted on that was being breached.
Being breached. That was the justification then. But what about when you say localization? Just tell me what that means, what you mean by that.
Localization would mean that especially Bismarck was planning a war before in very cold blood, you could say dramatically. And make sure that no other party would intervene. So he would frame it as an inner German conflict between Prussia and Austria, for example, or between Prussia and Denmark in the War of 1864, or Prussia and France later in 1870-71, to make sure that no foreign power would intervene, because there was always understood as the biggest danger that the war would generalize. And this is also where the doctrine of a short war comes from, what we said at the beginning, that the longer the war takes, the greater the risk is that another power would actually intervene. So it was not the task of the laws of war to prevent the outbreak of war in the 19th century. So just remember the shift we had with the Crimean War from the prevention of war to the regulation of warfare. However, these rules, at least I would say so, could only work as long as all the powers still were loyal to the overall system of international law. And this was possible only as long as there were individuals in power who knew what the system could handle and what it could not. Bismarck, for example, knew what he could do and what would not be possible to do with regard to the balance of power.
Elder statesman, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly also elder statements after that time, but I think there was also a difference between the people who still witnessed the times of 1800 and following, maybe the Napoleonic Wars even, and the Viennese system, and the people who did not witness that anymore.
So there was a younger guard, or a changing of the guards, if you will, leading up to World War I.
Exactly, and the German historian Volker Ulrich has a book on the German Empire which is called Die nervöse Großmacht, and I find that really fitting, the nervous great power of Germany.
Yes.
And after Bismarck more or less managed to unify Germany, he was very careful to make sure that no further danger for European stability will come from Germany. So the other powers would not be in alliance against Germany. And this, of course, this system, which was very difficult to keep up, and only someone like Bismarck and a few others maybe were able to keep it alive, completely crumbled under the rule of Wilhelm II then, who wanted to play the real world power of Germany. So the sources allow the argument that the First World War was understood as a special conflict from quite the beginning. It would be the general war entire Europe has been afraid of for years. You probably heard of the famous slogan, "The war that will end all wars," which goes back to newspaper publications by H.G. Wells already in 1914.
Yes, certainly.
And also later, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, in the 20th century, labeling the First World War as the great seminal catastrophe of our century, of this century, the 20th century, by George Kennan in 1979. Now, of course, the character of World War I could fill entire libraries and actually did so, but what was clear, however, is that the world would not be the same after the war. It was clear that this general war delegitimized already the old existing order by the mere fact of its outbreak, and made it obvious that a new order of international law in Europe would be created in one way or the other, depending which party would be the winning party, because each German-Austrian alliance, for example, had a certain plan of Europe, and so had, of course, the British, French, and the Americans later. So the empires were fighting for their very survival in a way, and especially in these cases, the German doctrine of Not kennt kein Gebot, necessity knows no law, leads to terrible consequences, the cruelest of them being the first deployment of poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. That's a more, let's say, theoretical approach to the application of the laws of war. But there's also a very technical legal approach, which is the so-called si omnes clause, which means that a treaty would only be applied if all parties to the conflicts have ratified the treaty. And given that World War I was a huge conflict with several parties involved, there were parties that did not ratify neither the Geneva Convention of 1906 and the Hague Convention of 1907. So a strong case can be made that these treaties as such were just not applicable for, let's say, formal legal reasons. On the other hand, now you can make the argument that they can be applied as customary international law, because there was opinio juris, so the conviction that this should be applied as law and accompanying practice. But here again, you would have the problem of identifying the exact scope of the provision and possible exceptions, which is always difficult when it comes to customary international law because it is not written down.
So, okay, we talked there, you ran us through about what happened in the lead up and during World War I and the laws of war. They may not have been successful in that instance, but they were successful in at least curbing warfare in the period of 100 years or so prior. So that means there was definitely some good elements involved or to be found in the laws of war. Would you say that anything has lived on from these peace congresses in modern political thought and statesmanship?
So that's a very good question, and as all good questions, probably also quite difficult to answer. So the congresses and conferences I analyzed were determined by the dynamics of their time, of course, and followed also the rules of 19th century European diplomacy. However, the internal correspondence shows that no power wanted to take on the odium of letting a conference on something good, quote unquote, fail, in particular everything that was given a humanitarian label. And of course, this was then exploited by making demands by the inviting power in advance that were hardly acceptable to the other party, which was known beforehand, because this would make the initiator gain the moral high ground, because they said we were ready to codify the laws of war in the most humane way, but was rejected by Britain, for example, because it would have also addressed in one way or the other naval warfare and the like. So occasionally one finds indications in the sources that the conference was expected from the beginning to fail, but that the participants nevertheless thought they had to go along with the spectacle in order to save face in front of the European public, which became increasingly a political factor. And so it was often about passing the buck to another power.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like much hasn't changed in that regard.
And this exactly reminds me sometimes of calls for negotiations of ceasefire and like by one party to the conflict, when the circumstantial evidence suggests that no common ground can be found from in the first place. We all know the famous war is merely the continuation of policy by other means, by Clausewitz, who I mentioned earlier. And I think sometimes it's equally true vice versa. Politics as the continuation of war by other means.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you would say that there are certain elements which have certainly absolutely lived on, but it's hard to pick out individual terms or phrases also because they were simply written up in another world almost before World War I, as you said, before the war to end all wars.
Exactly, but I think there are certain dynamics and tactics that are comparable, and this also seems to be noticed in the general public. There's a lot of newspaper articles I read and I saw which had in their headlines a return of the 19th century in one way or the other. And also Christopher Clark, the Cambridge historian who became especially famous for his Sleepwalkers book, was consulted so often if we have a 1914 situation again. And of course, these situations do not repeat themselves as such, but the dynamics and patterns can be comparable.
Plenty of political insight there into the brinkmanship that was going on in the 19th century. As I say, I'm sure someone at Netflix is listening to us and will be in contact shortly to start up a series on the laws of war. So thank you very much, Raphael. I really enjoyed our discussion today.
Thank you so much for having me. And if the Netflix thing should work out, you definitely have to be on board.
Thank you. I'll play one of the minor powers. All right, take care. Thanks for today's discussion.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.